Today's virtual theory webinar focuses on what I'm referring to as other North American wine regions. We've covered all of California, we've covered Oregon and Washington, which leaves a ton of area and a ton of wine regions that are pretty critical. So today we're going to take a look at the wine regions in New York State, in Michigan, in Virginia, in Ohio, Texas, Arizona. We're going to look at Canada. We're going to look at BC and Ontario and Quebec and Nova Scotia. We're going to take a look at Mexican wine growing regions too. So there's quite a bit of information to look over. And this, to be honest with you, is more of a 30,000 foot flyover. We're not going to go super deep on any of the individual regions. This will just give you basic talking points about each of these and hopefully some things that you can remember moving forward. We're going to start with a map of the United States, and this shows wineries essentially that are throughout the U.S. I think it's a pretty interesting map to take a look at, just to give you a feel for where wine's being grown all throughout the United States. It's not just in the places that we think of here on the West Coast in Washington, Oregon, and California. There are little dots of wine being grown all throughout the U.S. Well, we're going to start on the eastern side with two really large American viticultural areas. We start in Ohio, which was the top producer until 1859. During the Civil War, black rot and powdery mildew destroyed nearly all of its vineyards. The Ohio River Valley AVA covers Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Indiana. This is sort of a decent map of it. It just shows a little bit more overlap, but it's a pretty large AVA. Here in Ohio, Catawba, which was a made sparkling wine, was made famous by Nicholas Longworth at the time. You also have Martha's Vineyard, AVA. It's an island of Massachusetts surrounded by Vineyard Sound to the north, Nantucket Sound to the east, and Atlantic Ocean to the south. And then this other really large AVA, the Upper Mississippi River Valley, which covers, and you can see it here, zoom in on it, it covers Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. It's 30,000 square miles. It's the world's largest demarcated appellation. Pretty interesting. Another one to be aware of, the Pennsylvania Quality Assurance. You have to pass a tasting panel to receive a PQA seal. Currently only has 10 wineries though, so kind of small. Perhaps the most important on the East Coast though is the state of New York. You could see a handful of different growing regions here, right off Lake Ontario. You get Niagara Escarpment. There's Lake Erie AVA here off Lake Erie. And then, of course, you get the Finger Lakes, which is this green area. And within it, there are 5 fingers, essentially. We'll call it the center finger for PC purposes, is Seneca Lake. And it is one of the largest and deepest lakes in the United States and creates a really great mitigating effect. You also have Cayuga Lake. And there's a Cayuga Lake, I believe, is applied for AVA status here as well. But then on the sort of southeastern portion, you've got Hudson River Region AVA, the Long Island AVA, which also has the Hamptons and the North Fork. We'll talk a little bit about those. In New York, there's roughly 320 wineries. The majority of these are fairly young and under 20 years of age. On Long Island, you see a lot of ownership changes there recently. And then, of course, we go back in history to Dr. Konstantin Frank. He was a viticulturalist from Ukraine who planted vinifera in the 1960s. The Finger Lakes is headquarters to Constellation Brands, the second largest wine company in the world behind Gallo. Also, you've got the Geneva Research Center for Vine Training and Winter Hardy Varieties. We mentioned that Seneca Lake being a deep and center lake for the moderating effect on the climate around the vines. You also get a lake effect from Lake Ontario here. The Hudson River region in 1839 was the first recorded vintage at the Brotherhood Winery. Vineyards were established in Manhattan and Long Island in the middle of the 17th century, which make it America's oldest region. Major subregions here, we mentioned Long Island, great for whites, sparkling, and Bordelaise varieties with Norfolk, which probably the most significant quantities, the Hamptons, and then Long Island. And then Finger Lakes, we talked about Cayuga in 1988, Seneca Lake now perhaps the most important, established in 2003, and then Cayuga Lake surely to follow If you get the opportunity to go to the Finger Lakes, it is amazing. It's a beautiful drive all around it, and some great wineries around there. Climate in the area, of course, you have harsh winters, right, and lake effects in the Northeast. Long Island is a bit more maritime, though, similar to what you see in Bordeaux. And of course, you see that Lake Ontario lake effect along with Seneca Lake, lengthening the growing season for the Finger Lakes. Grape varieties are just grapes in general. Long Island, there's about 3,000 acres of vines, all vinifera, and mainly Chardonnay, Merlot, and the Cabernets. And the Finger Lakes, where you get away from the maritime climates, you get a lot less vinifera due to those harsh winters. But because of the hard wood for Riesling, it performs quite well here. Although we're also beginning to see Cabernet Franc and Pinot Noir do quite well. In the Hudson River region, you see more Chardonnay, Cabernet Franc. There's also little pockets of Friulano. And then Niagara Escarpment, Vidal, you'll see for ice wine. As we move further west, we get into both Ohio and then Michigan. Michigan is the 4th largest grape growing state, although for grapes intended for wine, it's the 8th largest. The AVAs are listed here. You can see Fenville, first AVA in Michigan in 1981. You've also got Leelanau Peninsula right up here, home to a lot of boutique wineries established in 1982. You get Lake Michigan Shore down here. You get Old Mission Peninsula. And then the tip of the mitt, which is the newest one that was just established in 2016. I haven't seen anything from it yet. I spoke to a friend in Michigan that's a good source, and he says he hasn't seen a whole lot just yet. Seems to be more prospecting than anything. In Ohio, you've got these 5 AVAs here. You've got the Ohio River Valley that we spoke about earlier. You've got Loramie Creek. You've got Isle St. George, Lake Erie, and the Grand River Valley. And these are subs of Lake Erie, Isle St. George and Grand River Valley. And you can see why they sit right here on that lake, on Lake Erie. That provides another mitigating effect. Soil types just in general for the regions that we've talked about. In Long Island, you see a lot more glacial. North Fork of Long Island's less silt and loam. Finger Lakes, again, glacial. You see shale, you see slate on the slopes, silty, sandy, and loamy. There was a picture a few minutes ago, actually. Let me jump back to that real quick just to show you. These are some slate boulders in one of the vineyards that my boss, Paul Hobbs, owns in Finger Lakes right off Lake Seneca. These things are huge. In the Hudson River region, you see shale, schist, and limestone. In Michigan, you get glacial scree, and I wanted to throw up a picture of just what scree is. That's basically rock that's strewn across mountainsides. Ohio, you get shallow drift soil over fissured limestone bedrock on that Isle St. George, the sub of Lake Erie. And then Pennsylvania, you see some deep limestones, derived soils in the Lancaster Valley. Great producers from around Long Island, you see Shin Estates in the North Fork, along with Commanock and Wolfer Estate in the Hamptons. For Finger Lakes, you see a lot more, right? Red Newt, Standing Stone, of course. Perhaps the 2 most important there, though, Herman J. Weimer and Dr. Frank's Vinifera Wine Cellars. You also have Heart and Hands, Ravines, and of course, Element. In the Hudson River region, you'll find Millbrook and Clinton Vineyards. Niagara Escarpment only has 8 wineries at this point. In Michigan, you find Tabor Hill planted the first European varieties here in 1970. There's like Chateau Grand Traverse, Peninsula Cellars, Black Star Farms, and Malby, famous for sparkling wine in the Leelanau Peninsula. Good vintages here, low yields in 2010 in New York and Michigan, high quality for reds. Cabernet Sauvignon did exceptionally well. 2009, you get long hang time in autumn, so great for Northeastern Riesling. 2008, rainy and somewhat difficult, although some of the Finger Lake Rieslings are good. 2007, apparently great for red wines in the Northeast, and 2006, better for whites. I don't know that I've seen a whole lot of older vintage New York wines at this point. I would love to try them out. The next region we're going to take a look at is Virginia. And you can see a handful of AVAs that are nestled within Virginia, including Rocky Knob, the North Fork of Roanoke, Shenandoah Valley, perhaps the most important, Monticello, Northern Neck, George Washington Birthplace, a very interesting AVA name, and then Virginia's Eastern Shore AVA. Major subregions here, grapes. Virginia has 3,200 acres of grapes at this point. You see a lot of Nebbiolo, Vermentino, Malvasia, Cabernet Franc, Chardonnay, Merlot, Viognier, Petit Verdot, and Norton. The AVAs are listed here that we went over, and you can see what years they were established too. Virginia Eastern Shore was the first, but I really think that Monticello AVA is perhaps most important at the point. Heat and humidity at harvest can really sink the acidity and induce cryptogamic disease for fungals and gray rot. You have hot summers, you have cool winters that keep the soil cool. It causes a late bud break. You also, of course, have the Appalachian Mountains and Chesapeake Bay. The Blue Ridge Mountains are about 30 miles west of most of the vineyards, but they're just east of Shenandoah Valley. In Virginia, you have lots of clay. Rocky Knob is more known for silty loam and gravel, and the North Fork of Roanoke has limestone and sandstone. Great producers, of course, Barbersville, owned by Zonin, which perhaps makes sense for some of their Italian varieties from the 1970s. The Horton Vineyards, known for their Viognier. Chrysalis, known for Norton. Boxwood, which is pioneer of the Middleburg, Virginia AVA. You also have Donald Trump and Steve Case from AOL. And then Chateau Morissette in Rocky Knob. Next, we'll take a look at Texas. Handful of AVAs here, and you can see them listed. Perhaps most important are the Texas High Plains and then the Texas Hill Country viticultural area. Within the Hill Country, you've got two subs, Fredericksburg and then Bell Mountain. And then interesting that it passes over, but Mesilla Valley is sort of shared with New Mexico. See, you know, Italian and Spanish varieties today. Texas wine kind of got its start really in the 1990s, and everyone was planting Cabernet and Chardonnay and things that they liked to drink at the time. It took a little while to realize that those weren't really going to work out in Texas. And so we're beginning to see a lot more warm weather varieties that function, which I think pays attention to these Italian and Spanish varieties that we're seeing today. Here's another list of the AVAs. Within the AVAs, the Texas High Plains, of course, has hot summers, and then you get windy, dry, cold winters. So you'll have frost, hail, and then high temperatures. Texas, New Mexico, the Mesilla Valley is known for alluvial, stratified, deep and well-drained soils. The Texas High Plains is deep calcareous, and you get the Ogallala Aquifer for water. You also get up to 4,000 feet in elevation in certain areas. And then Thomas B. Munson famously created the Phylloxera immune rootstock. Of the 36 genus of Vitis, 15 plus are Texas natives. Great producers in the area. On the High Plains, you find Llano Estacado, Caprock, McPherson. And Escondido Valley, this is over half the total production from about 1,000 acres of a University of Texas vineyard, Mesa Vineyards, and Peregrine Hill. In the Texas Hill Country, you find Dukeman, Viviano, Messina Hoff, Fall Creek, and then in Texoma, you find Inwood Estates. Issues with Texas, we run into a lot of drought. And so you'll commonly see that some producers are using grapes from other states to, well, just keep business going, keep the lights on in certain years. Arizona has 3 regions, the Verde Valley, sort of center Arizona, and then in the southeast portion, you find Sonoyta, Elgin, and Wilcox. You also see stuff in Colorado, west of the Rocky Mountains. You get the Grand Valley and West Elks AVAs. I actually had some really amazing Chenin Blanc from there at Frosca at a Colorado wine dinner last year. And there was a winemaker, I think he was from Acacia originally. I can't remember exactly what winery he was from, but the wines were pretty fantastic, to be honest with you. You see Chardonnay, Merlot, Riesling, Viognier, Sangiovese, Syrah. In Arizona, you see more Syrah. In San Gio, you also see Cabernet Franc, Zinfandel, Malvasia, and then you see Cab Pfeffer, which is basically high pyrazine Cabernet. It's a little kitschy, if you will. Here's those AVAs for Arizona again. In Wilcox, you get over 4,000 feet in elevation. Verde Valley is affected by the Verde River, thus the name. You also have the Chiricahua Mountains in Wilcox. The Verde Valley is about 3,000 feet in elevation. It gets to 5,000 feet at Sedona Red Rocks. And then you've also got some mountains through Sonoita, the Santa Rita, Huachuca, and Whetstone Mountains. And then you get Sonoita Creek, Cienega Creek, and Babacamari River. Great producers here in Sonoita and Wilcox, you'll find Callahan, Rune, Dos Cabezas El Campo. In Wilcox, you'll find Golden Rule, Sand Reckoner, Sachem Cellars, and Garage East. And then Cochise County, which is 20 miles north of Wilcox, is where Caduceus is, which is, of course, Maynard Keenan from Tools Winery. You also have Golden Rule. Other soils that you find in Wilcox, it's more volcanic ash. In Verde Valley, you find alkaline, sandstone, and bedrock with volcanic and caliche. And then in Sonoita, you have Terra Rossa, famous of the Cunawara, right? That red limestone, or red bedrock over limestone. Pretty cool. Next, we're going to take a look at Mexico. And so there's a few places that are growing wine here, but perhaps the most important to pay attention to for quality today is the Guadalupe Valley here in the northern Baja. But we'll take a look at all of them in general. History for the area, 1530. In the 1530s, there's a decree, from Governor Hernando Cortez that everyone plant 10 vines a year for every Indian slave in their estate. Mexico in 1699 had a ban on New Mexico vineyards by the King of Spain, which effectively ended the development of all wineries for 3 centuries. Mexico also has one of the oldest wineries, actually the oldest contiguously operating winery in North America, and that's Casa Madero. It's founded in 1597 in the Paras Valley. This is in Coahuila, just southwest of Texas, just a few hours away. They make some pretty interesting Chenin Blancs and Syrahs here too. Also, Santo Tomas in Baja in 1888. You find Lecheto, founded in 1926. I was a pioneer for wine in Baja, and then Juan Ugarte planted in Baja in 1701, as far back as 1701. There's a bunch of subregions that you can take a look at. I'm not necessarily sure how important all of these are at this point. As I mentioned, I think Guadalupe Valley and Baja is perhaps most important for quality grape growing at this point. Also important to note that there's a lack of water here, which generally means really highly intense red wines. Climate, in SoCal, Temecula Valley AVA gets cooled by the Rainbow Gap that's right across the border. Guadalupe Valley, though, is maritime, and the Baja, of course, very Mediterranean. Everything else is basically arid, or continental in the case of Guanajuato, but it's all desert, right? Soil types throughout the area, there are interesting amount of variations here. In Guadalupe Valley, it's important to know that it's sandy in the valley, and then the hillsides provide you with more granite and poor clay. As you could expect with arid deserts, right? There's a lot of clay, a lot of volcanics, a lot of sand. As far as aspect and geography, I think it's important to note too that Baja is about 400 meters in elevation. But in some of the more inland areas, you'll see up to 3,300 meters in Querétaro. You get the Sierra Madres that affect Durango and Guanajuato. Zacatecas and Aguascalientes get up to almost 2,000 meters in elevation. And then 1,500 meters in Pares de la Fuente. Pretty interesting. Producers, not a ton that I'm aware of at this point. Of course, you got Beachy right there in the northern portion of the Baja. Actually, I think they're further, they're like Temecula almost. Paralello in Valle de Guadalupe has about 450 acres. They're super ecological. They purchased land from Domecq. You also have Casa de Piedra, Villa Montefiore, Adobe Guadalupe, and Carubiel. These two are perhaps the most commonly seen here in Texas, at least. And then you get Freixenet, oddly enough, making sparkling wine in Zacatecas, just north of Mexico City. Next, we're going to take really just a flyover of Canada, kind of like what we did with Mexico there, just to make sure that you're familiar with maps and where things are and kind of understand where the viticultural areas are. The two over here listed on the left side are perhaps the most important quality wine growing regions in Canada. British Columbia, of course, on the west coast, and has a handful of viticultural areas, perhaps most important, the Okanagan Valley. We'll talk about that a little more in depth. And then Ontario, just north of the US, on the northern shores of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, of course with Niagara Peninsula, Lake Erie North Shore, and Prince Edward County. We'll get a look at those. But also on the East Coast, you find Quebec and Nova Scotia. And these have some wine growing regions. We're really just going to look at the map and kind of glance over those real quick. History in Canada, there was prohibition in the 1920s. The free trade agreement with the US caused more focus on quality, coupled with a government vine pool scheme. In Ontario, you've got about 15,000 acres of vinifera today. Canada, you saw a movement toward vinifera in the 50s and 60s. The 70s, Deschanach was still the most planted grape variety. You also have the Horticultural Research Center of Ontario at Vineland. Soil types across the areas, Prince Edward Island, you see limestone, Ontario's sandy loams to gravel, sand, and clay. And then Okanagan in the BC has very varied, pardon me, soils across it. You see sandy loam clay on the west bank, stony sandy clay on the east bank, rocky and gravelly in the south, and then lighter and sandier in the north. Here's that map of Quebec and their wine regions. I've never seen one of these. Might be important to know the St. Lawrence Seaway kind of splits it. I'd love to taste some wine from there, but it would be cool. Here's Nova Scotia. These are tiny, okay? I mean, tiny. Look, here's Bear River. Here's Lehave River. Here's Annapolis Valley. This little Avon River right next to it, and then Malagash Peninsula. I know I've had oysters from Malagash, but I've never had any other wine. It'd be cool to try them together. But next we need to talk about the VQA appellations in Ontario. There's three right here, and I think perhaps the most important is the peninsula. And within the peninsula, you have sub-appellations. Right here, the most important, though, perhaps, is the Niagara Escarpment. And it includes the Beamsville Bench, the 20 Mile Bench, and the Short Hills Bench. It does not include these areas around it. And then you get the Niagara on the Lake, sub-appellations of Niagara Lake Shore, Niagara River, 4 Mile Creek, and St. David's Bench. Listed out here, Ontario, Niagara Peninsula. Your two mains are Niagara Escarpment and Niagara on the Lake. Each one of those has sub-appellations within them. And then you have that Lake Erie North Shore, which has 9 south islands right there. So I lifted this off of somebody's Prezi online, and I thought it was really good. Let's take a look at it. Here's an overview of the Niagara Escarpment. It's a huge ridge of sedimentary rock that stretches up to 1,675 feet high. It's part of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence lowlands landform region. It's located throughout southern Ontario, and it forms a horseshoe around the Michigan Basin. But really, as it comes up, you can see it cuts through right through that Niagara Peninsula growing region that we're focusing on. And then agriculturally, it provides moderating effects of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. In the spring, you get cool air from Lake Ontario that protects vines from late spring frosts. And then in the fall, the warm air from the lake creates a long and warm fall, which gives the grapes ideal sugar content and growth. So as far as styles and encépagement in Canada and in Ontario, about 50% of ice wine exports, but less than 5% of the production. They're also known to bury their vines to survive harsh winters. We mentioned the Deschanach. You've got some other hybrids here too, Baco Noir, Rosette, Marichal Folk. Now you see more Riesling, Chardonnay, Cabernet Franc, and Pinot Noir on the peninsula. Ontario, you've got Lake Ontario, you've got the escarpment, that north-facing cliff formation dividing the appellation, and you get the Lake Iroquois plain. It's the same parallel as Tuscany, interestingly enough. We mentioned the VQA. This was launched in 1988 as mandatory for Ontario, and in 1990 as voluntary at BC. It states that 100% of the grapes are grown in the state of province, 95% of the grapes are grown in the state of appellation for British Columbia, and 85% for Ontario, 100% for sub-appellations, which includes Niagara Peninsula, and 100% if it's a single vineyard. All Ontario and BC VQA must be vintage dated, except for sparkling, with 85% of the grapes from that particular vintage. The varietal wines have to be 85%. You can only, of course, use selected varieties, and your chaptalization chaptalization, acidification, and must weights are of course limited. Great producers of the area in Ontario, you find bright wines, and then on Niagara Peninsula, you find Cave Spring, Flat Rock Cellars, Chateau de Charme, and Stratus. Stratus, I think, had a 100-point wine a few years ago, for what it's worth. I don't know how many Canadian 100-pointers there are out there. British Columbia on the west coast. You can see here, let's go ahead and zoom in while we're here. Bam. Vancouver Island. You also have the Gulf Islands here. You've got Fraser Valley, the Okanagan Valley right here next to Kelowna. I always mispronounce the name of that place. Similkameen Valley here. And then each of these have, well, a lot of unofficial subregions, but Okanagan Valley famously has the Golden Mile GI within it. Okanagan is known for its continental climate. You got long daylight hours. The summers here are actually hotter than the California coastal areas, and the winters are a little cause for concern when it comes to vine damage. In the south, you only get 6 inches of rain annually. Major subregions, I think it's important to note Okanagan sits between the Cascades and the Monashee Mountains. So a great little valley there. Canada and in BC in general, you're seeing more Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, Merlot, and Pinot Blanc. The Vintners Quality Association appellations for BC, the ones with a GI next to them are official. So your Vancouver Island, Fraser Valley, Similkameen Valley, Okanagan, and Gulf Islands. Okanagan provides 82% of the production of the area. And the only one with a real official GI is the Golden Mile in Okanagan. But it's important to note these other unofficial islands that are here too: Black Sage, Kelowna, Naramata, and Okanagan Falls. Great vintages for Canada. I mean, it's kind of hard to say an entire country, right? But 2010, great in Ontario, but BC needed to thin their crop. 2009, great in Ontario for whites and ice wines, good in BC. Variable 08, 07 was excellent countrywide. 06 was the hottest, driest season on record with devastating frost. The wines are great, but there was almost no crop. And in 2005, you saw great ice wines. That's my show for today. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope you've got the opportunity to try some wines from these other North American wine growing regions. If not, seek them out and make sure you at least pay attention to them and are aware that they are out there. We'll see you guys again next time. Cheers.